Hello, this is Michael Hexter, and welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. This episode I'm calling Hamas Attacks and Israeli Occupier Reprisals Will Reinforce Talion Cycle of Violence and Fundamentalism. So the critical word in that title is Talion, and that's the sort of the new piece of information that I'm offering you, who I'm assuming some of you are knowledgeable about what's going on in Israel, Palestine. But I'll rehearse some of that. And these are ongoing events. The attacks, the offensive by Hamas happened just earlier today, and there are Israeli reprisals going on as we speak. And so the point I'm trying to extract from this, again, I don't know the exact details and the course of the events that will occur in Israel, Palestine, in this particular episode. But I do see basically Hamas and the Israeli far right that controls the government reinforcing each other, okay? And Hamas is they are sometimes being celebrated by some Palestinians or many Palestinians. They're as freedom fighters or what have you, but their methods and so forth and so on are reprehensible, as are in much greater number and with greater strength, the methods and goals of the Israeli state, and with regard to the rights of the Palestinians, the land the Palestinians have owned or occupied, or that they for millennia. So anyway, or for hundreds of years, whatever. But anyway, for a long time, and this these two sides are both what I'm calling fundamentalists. Okay, the Hamas are fundamentalists, and also the dominant right wing faction in the Israeli government are fundamentalists. They believe in a religious fantasy or collective fantasy or mythos of Judea and Samaria, and that then the sort of the entitlement of Jews to have the entirety of what was previously 2 millennia ago, Israel, or what they're calling Judea and Samaria. So, and that they think their entitlement preempts that of Palestinians who lived there for many, many years, and who before the early 20th century were, the overwhelming majority of people in that area. So anyway, so these fundamentalists are reinforcing each other by doing terroristic things to each other, or genocidal things to each other, and creating, so each side, Hamas, I would wish for the Palestinians to have a more secular and also socialistic, not right-wing, militant group that would be fighting for them. And it's very hard. I mean, again, on the other hand, in complete sympathy to the Palestinians, they are so pushed to the wall, and they have hardly any civic structure or political sphere where they could have arguments about what to do about their situation, and they are so overwhelmed militarily and economically by the Israelis, with the support of the United States, ample support, with the abundant support of the United States and also the European Union. So anyway, so that you have these two right-wing sides that are fighting each other, and militant, militarily oriented, militaristic, and they see an opportunity in a way to reinforce their fundamentalism by the behavior of the other side. So this is not, I'm not saying, the Israelis started this, okay, but the Hamas is simply responding to that. It's not I'm not justifying their atrocities. I definitely am not justifying the atrocities of the Israeli, we can call them IOF, Israeli offensive forces, okay? So I'm not, they neither justify morally each other, okay? And one is much more powerful. In other words, the Israeli side is much more powerful. So anyway, so this Talion cycle that I'm calling is the cycle of tit for tat. Okay, so you've heard of tit for tat, that if someone does something to you, you often have the impulse to do that same thing back to them, or you might. It depends on your psychology, on your position of power, your power position, whether you are able to do that. So, but there are cycles of reinforcing actions, okay, that you can call tit for tat. And there was the idea of the Talion law is from the Bible, Hillel, an eye for an eye. Okay, so and this is an idea of justice. So in other words, so you have equivalent. You do the equivalent damage. If someone blinded someone else, then you get blinded according to this Talion law. Okay, and so this is a standard of justice that I don't agree with. That we need a higher form of justice, or justice that overcomes the Italian law, that doesn't necessarily turning the other cheek. So turning the other cheek is one way to quote unquote interrupt this Talion cycle, but it doesn't. It can lead to basically one side, the side that doesn't turn its cheek, taking over and creating more injustice and more damage by simply not being responded to, saying, well, I hit you, let me hit this other person, let me hit that, I don't have any, there's no consequences for this action that I've done. So the idea of the Talion law was supposed to inhibit people from being aggressive with other people or their other people's property, without consequence, and that so people would think that saying, well, I don't want this happening to me, so therefore this standard of justice. So anyway, and I was led to think about this by an obscure, now deceased, psychoanalyst in the object relation school called Heinrich Racker, who was from Hungary originally and then spent much of his or later career in Argentina, and in basically the 1940s and 50s. And he had this idea of that the psychoanalyst, the therapist, okay, is trying to interrupt in an individual a vicious cycle of reinforcing actions in their mind. So in their mind, it could be something that happens in their daily life in terms of their relationships, how they treat other people, so creating a cycle like that. But for a psychoanalyst, for someone of his school and approach, it was mostly intrapsychic, in other words, inside someone's mind, that they would be oppressed by these cycles and you see therapists in different ways, not necessarily from the school of psychoanalytic or object relation school, attempting to encourage patients not to, to get out of bad relationships or whatever, or situations that reinforce their sense of depression, their sense of anxiety, any number of different, their own dysfunctional responses to those situations. So Racker thought, and that the role of the psychoanalyst was to attenuate this Talion. He wasn't, maybe you're not aware, psychoanalysis is not a sort of prescriptive thing where what I'm describing is like more therapists that you would maybe be more familiar with, or therapeutic scenarios that you'd be more familiar with, where someone prescribes that or suggests to someone, saying, well, wait a minute, that's dysfunctional, that's not a good situation for you, so that's more of the kind of eclectic psychotherapy that's often practiced in many studio whatever or offices, therapy offices, but this other psychoanalysis is supposed to be going deep into your psyche and so forth and so on, and anyway, so the psychoanalyst is supposed to create this environment where these Talion cycles are attenuated, where the patient is no longer so harshly stigmatized or castigating themselves, hurting themselves by their own thoughts, and that they gradually gain more freedom and space to see that relationships between one action and another are not necessary. There's not like they're not caught in a cycle of saying, well, I have to do that. If someone does that to me, I have to do that thing back to them. And again, this is mostly in the mind. So, but you could say it transposes pretty nicely to a relationship where you feel like you don't have to respond as they are calling you out to do. And this is something that is called in that particular school of psychoanalysis projective identification. So you put someone in projective identification, you put someone in a situation where they feel like just by the different sort of cues that you give and your tone of voice, or the words that you say, or whatever it is, that you give them a sense that they have only one choice to respond to you in one way. And, you don't, this is not conscious, this is semi-conscious or unconscious. You are put in a situation where you respond to them in a certain way, and there are people who are very, very good at creating that kind of force field around them, where they compel people to respond to them in certain ways by acting a certain way, so forth and so on. And, you could think about, a small child, for instance, and this is evolutionarily adaptive. A small child it's needy, that needs other people to care for it, by crying, by creating immediately your sense of you feel, many people feel protective of the child. They feel like they have to do something. So that is a very common, and you could say normal, kind of projective identification, where you are put in a situation where you feel the need to, and you should really. So I'm calling it normal projective identification. You cannot get rid of entirely of projective identification in this way, which is creating. It's the opening bid to having a relationship with someone, or having a conversation with someone, and not only opening bid. It's a recurring rebid, of whatever the conversation you're having with them, or the interaction you're having with them. So I know I'm talking a lot about individual psychology or interpersonal psychology here, but this applies to international conflicts and conflicts between peoples, and peoples who have, among other things, long interactions and relationships, like the Palestinians and the Israelis, where now Israelis have had so much more control over the environment and over, so that they force, or there's a very, very narrow band of responses that Palestinians can have, and it takes a great deal of effort for Palestinians to be both civil and assertive of their rights, and to engage in a nonviolent response to the violence that comes from the Israeli state. They are very, very constrained, especially in Gaza, and so it's not. I'm not, again, justifying this response by Hamas and these attacks and how they've conducted them, but it's also it's what the projective identification, the signals that Israel or the Israeli government is giving to Palestinians, that basically they have only this violence as their only way to express, to assert themselves. And so, at least within this dialogue, so within this framework. So to overcome this Talion cycle. So anyway, this cycle with two armed people who are, or one is heavily armed, the other is barely armed, or only armed sometimes or whatever, or but anyway, one is supposedly the official armed people, that's the Israelis, and then there's supposedly the illegally armed people who are the Palestinians or the Hamas. But anyway, the arming being extremely strong form of projective identification, in that you are, if you are unarmed in the presence of someone who's armed, your degrees of freedom that you have to respond in particular ways is very, very narrow. And then so the acquisition of arms and the attempt to sort of respond is then one avenue that appears for groups within that people. But this cycle is going to continue, the cycle of tit for tat, of people feeling constrained by the situation, is going to continue unless there is I believe, a lot of third parties, the UN, the United States, needs to step in and create, and with the notion that there are universal human rights, and that mostly the rights of the Palestinians are being violated. Occasionally, here and there are war crimes perpetrated against Israeli civilians and so forth and so on, but or crimes, whatever you call them, but war crimes or crimes, that are so. But anyway, that crime, for instance, the crimes that Hamas are committing or have committed in the last 24 hours are not justification for the massive reprisals that the Israeli military are no doubt have already engaged in, bombed a big apartment building in Gaza, and other things will happen. But that is so. They would like us to think that the Israeli government would like us to think there's only one response to those acts of Hamas, and that only one response is violent reprisal and massacres of Palestinians. But there needs to be a breaking up of this logic of, and in order to do that, there needs to be a convergence on this region by the United States. So there needs to be military aid for Israel. Israel needs to be conditioned and needs to be cut a lot. Israel needs to withdraw its settlements in the West Bank. They need to allow the fanatical settlers that are driving Israeli policy in many areas of Israel and also the West Bank need to be put on the same level as any other inhabitant of that region, Palestinian or Israeli. They cannot dictate policy. They cannot act as though they own what isn't theirs, and also call in and expect military backing for their fantasies about a greater Israel or Judea and Samaria. So, and this cycle though of thinking that one violent act is necessarily needs to have the repercussions. So that is the pairing of acts. That is the tit-for-tat. That is this Talion. That needs to be interrupted, and so it needs to be interrupted by. We would hope that the Israelis have more freedom to decide. The Israeli government has more freedom to decide how it responds to Hamas's attacks, and it is now. I wouldn't expect Hamas. So after years, so if I were a Palestinian, I would absolutely loathe and hate Israel, and I would be in some ways justified. I wouldn't be necessarily being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for such feelings or for such expression of such feelings, but it's understandable. So there needs to be now Israelis, of course, could feel like, well, I was attacked by a Palestinian, so I hate them, so on and so on. But it's like, well, you took a lot of their land, so, and your army routed them out of their mosque and killed people and shot them and supported fanatical, not necessarily you, but fanatical people who are also Israelis or whatever settlers. They supported their attacks on Palestinians. So anyway, so the cycle of this tit-for-tat cycle needs to be broken. And again, Israel has more, but I wouldn't expect Israel can't do that alone, in the sense that not can't, but it is highly, highly unlikely that they can do it alone. And that there's also, it's not as though I would expect a blooming of love between those peoples anytime soon. So there's going to be lots of hatred. And hatred meaning often the impulse to initiate a aggressive interaction with someone, being, wanting to do violence to them, or certainly an overreaction to one action, so to speak, by, beating someone up but I mean, hatred is often just this, you see videos of Israelis filled with hatred for Arabs doing things against and unprovoked. Okay, so there's no provocation from the Palestinian people. I mean, sometimes there is, but most of the time there isn't. So it comes from inside those people, or inside the political process in Israel and the cultural process in Israel that supports those hatreds. So anyway, so the start of a rational process is going to involve dealing with people who are not going to be instantaneously Mohandas Gandhi anytime soon. Okay, and so that so we have to understand that those impulses, to the aggressive impulses, are not going to vanish and evaporate, and it's a long process. As in returning to Racker, certainly he psychoanalysis is a years-long process. So, again, I will hope for the best, and I hope it's quicker than that. But anyway, there is you need to recognize reality, and the reality of your feelings, the entire range of your feelings, and not feel, like all of your hatreds are going to go away if Israel suddenly, a peace now government takes over the Knesset and starts. It's not going to all be roses, and there needs to be this. It's going to be long and painful. But currently, there is this cycle of violence and so on is on track to becoming more and more intense and more destructive, and leading to more devastation mostly for Palestinians, but also not great for Israelis either. Anyway, so I hope this was had some points of view here that were a little bit different or a little bit, gave you a little perspective that was maybe it was new for you. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and please subscribe to Politics 2100 for updates on videos that I post. Please like the video if you thought it had something worthwhile in it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks.